Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to the View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is February 7th, 2018. Tonight, another background show for the upcoming Ontario election, but the subject matter is right across Canada and right across the so-called First World, and it's making its way into the developing countries, shall we say. Public-private partnerships, P3s. Doesn't sound like much. The whole idea started back in the 80s. You know, Saint Reagan, Saint Thatcher, that sort of thing. The idea is that it gives more infrastructure for public use with lower financial cost compared to the government doing all the work. Well, it hasn't really worked out that way. Surprise, surprise. Numerous Auditor General reports provincially all across Canada, every one of them said the same thing. We're not saving any money here whatsoever. Ontario has a P3 habit back in 2014 already. Their Auditor General said they spent $8 billion more than they should have. Rick Barnes has been a union and social justice advocate in British Columbia and Ontario. In the 1990s, he worked for the NDP government in BC in various roles. In 2000, he went on to work for BC PWA and AIDS Vancouver before relocating to Ontario in 2006 to work in cooperative housing. Today, Rick is retired and volunteers for a wide range of social justice groups in Ontario and across Canada. Rick can be found on Twitter at Queer Thoughts. And Rick was my guest tonight. This was recorded a couple days ago. We're going to discuss Ontario's P3 habit, the pain to come that's unavoidable, and will it really make any difference? Who wins the Ontario election? Can anybody make a difference in this mess? And now we welcome to the View Up Here, Rick Barnes. Hello, Rick. Welcome to the show.
Howdy, Glenn. It's nice to be here.
Well, thank you very much for appearing. Now, I remember a time, as I'm sure you do and many listeners do, when crown corporations were a public good, where people understood the purpose of them, which differs quite a bit from the general perception today that crown corporations are meant to help government insiders, help government create monopolies, etc., etc. It never started that way, did it?
No, crown corporations were started, and in particular, when you look at hydro and telephone services across Canada, these were started by conservative governments and liberal governments across the country. And when they were established, they were largely established to provide for the growth of commerce. We all needed, at that time, we needed to have reliable power. And we also needed not to be gouged by different power providers or different telephone providers. So you found in the 1900s, Ontario Hydro was founded by, surprisingly, a conservative government that set it up. And it was meant to provide power, reliable power, across the province to those who were providing jobs, to those who were living in these communities, to provide for consumers of power. And the government would not be at the beck and call of private industry when it came to that particular issue. So you find even today in British Columbia, the town of Nelson still has its own power company. That company came from those times, those exciting times.
Yeah, they are definitely the exception, or they have retained their communal ownership of their system locally. But, you know, what you just described there with government seeing a need to avoid problems such as lack of supply, being held ransom for rates at certain times, depending on demand, etc., it seemed to me that crowns were meant to, well, I guess socialize is a strong word, but it was meant to keep things fair more than anything, with Big Brother government being able to say, now look, this is how we want things to work. If you want to play along, these are the rules. And this worked great for decades, but, you know, like what you mentioned, think about what's happened with telecommunications since the advent of the cell phone. Think about what happened with Enron at the turn of this century. That's exactly the opposite of what crowns were intended to do, is it not?
Exactly. And you bring up the example of Enron, and which is what happens when you privatize government services or utilities for the private sector. In the United States, they have a thing which now prevents states from providing their own electrical company, which goes back to Ronald Reagan in the 80s, in getting rid of and forcing states to sell their interest. And what's particularly interesting about this is that very red states around Montana and Utah and Wyoming had a collective hydro system which the states owned, and they were forced to sell as a result of Reagan's privatization, which led to things like Enron down the road. And I had an opportunity to talk to a Democratic governor in Montana way back in 2005, about 2005, where he was telling me the state of Montana would love to get back to owning their own hydro system. They're prevented by U.S. law to this day from doing so. And when you go to Alberta, where they canceled the hydro system, or they privatized the hydro system in a big way and created the open market, they really created an opportunity to make profits at the expense of you and I.
Well, exactly. That's the biggest difference I see between the idea of the crown utility and then what, through decades, the government has done to basically eliminate all those safeguards and all those controls to protect the citizens, the taxpayers themselves. So, I mean, is this simply just the neoliberal avalanche that has been with us since Reagan and Thatcher? Or has it just become part of our system now that's going to be harder than hell to change? Is it going to just keep going, or what can be done for people to realize that they're getting ripped off on things that everybody needs?
Well, what's happened is, as I mentioned earlier, or I'm going to mention now, is that the last time government thoroughly was on the side of the public, the general public, and not on the side of corporations was in the 70s. We started that trek with Ronald Reagan and with Margaret Thatcher, and later John Major and Tony Blair in Britain, and in Canada with Jean Chretien after Brian Mulroney,
Yes.
and in Ontario with Mike Harris, followed by Dalton McGuinty, and then we, in British Columbia, starting in the late 80s under the Social Credit and Bill Bennett, and Ralph Klein in Alberta managed to move so many government services into the private sector. The idea changed. There was a big change in the 70s. And it all started, I believe, somewhere around 1983, when there was a worldwide kind of recession. And governments were reluctant to raise taxes on corporations and had started cutting taxes on those corporations several years before. And that's where the ability to provide these services disappeared, and the idea that the private sector does things better. So government shouldn't be in retail, so we shouldn't sell things like alcohol. We shouldn't be in the business of selling electricity. The private sector will meet the demand. But in all of this, what happens is the private sector has to make a profit, because people are investing in the private sector to make a profit. That's why you do it.
Yes.
And so if you take that away from the government, where the government doesn't have to make a profit, the government is providing service. Now everything is defined by, can you make a profit? And the government can't make a profit.
Well, it does seem to be a betrayal of the taxpayer, of the voter. But, like you said, I mean, especially if you look at something like the United States, ever since Reagan, despite the rhetoric, despite the supposed political position of a president on the left-right scale, there's been absolutely no slowdown in the privatization of things that were built with tax dollars, built efficiently, built correctly, and then just selling them to others to make money off of before providing services with. Now, isn't that really the problem?
That is the problem. And there were some efforts, and it was a very successful effort. We look to, I'll go back to Rogers not having a mobile phone store now in Saskatchewan anymore. The Saskatchewan government, through SaskTel, which is a Crown corporation, provides the cheapest cable television, the cable internet, and mobile service in all of Canada. And that remains a very popular service in Saskatchewan. But because it is so good at what it does, the private sector wants it sold because they can make more money on Saskatchewan Telephone, which has spent a great deal to and is profitable to provide these services to people of Saskatchewan.
I find that to be a very interesting example because Saskatchewan is sparsely populated. Population centers are generally very far apart, but yet it's a crown with what I would think would be traditional crown management methods that has provided the best value for customers. And instead of the corporate sector trying to match SaskTel with their efficiencies and their infrastructure, their default is to simply tell the government to sell them because they're apparently too competitive for the so-called private sector who knows best.
The private sector can't make money in this model. That's the problem. The provincial government has expanded the services through SaskTel at Crown Corporation so that the benefits are enjoyed by most of the people in that province. If you live in Ontario, where you have only private options with respect to your telephone services, your cable, and your mobile telephone, you're losing because you have to pay in a monopoly owned by Rogers, TELUS, and Bell huge amounts of cash every month for your service. People in Saskatchewan are paying close to half of what we're paying in Ontario. And the Ontario experience, when you compare that to Saskatchewan, you can compare this to British Columbia, you can compare it to Alberta or to Quebec. The Saskatchewan experience is that Crown Corporation is providing a service that does not require a profit. What it does is have to develop and deliver a return to the people of Saskatchewan. And it does that by providing services at cost and covering their costs and their ability to maintain and expand that network. We don't have that in Ontario.
I think that's the perfect descriptor for it right there. That is the difference between a crown and a corporation that is basically granted a position where they cannot be defeated. They can be competed with, but they can't be defeated. And I think that's it right there. SaskTel mandate is to deliver services and not lose money. That's all. But with the big three, that's not nearly enough, obviously. Never mind if their level of service is satisfactory, which I'm sure we could find millions across Canada who would say they surely are not. And isn't that also what the CRTC has become? Merely the arbiter for the big three to tell people what they're going to pay to make the big three happy. Isn't that really how it turns out?
Exactly, because the federal government has failed to recognize the need to provide affordable services to Canadians. They've allowed and invested. First of all, the federal government has invested billions of dollars over the years into Canada's connectivity through various supports for TELUS and Rogers and Bell and Shaw and a few others to build local networks, to support rural connections. It hasn't been fabulously successful because you look to an area in Ontario just west of Ottawa, where I have an old farm. My old farm is 60 miles west of Ottawa. At that farm, up until about 3 or 4 years ago, I could not get DSL internet access. I'm 60 miles from the capital of Canada. I couldn't get cell coverage until 3 years ago. And the cell coverage I get now is very, very poor. Yet the federal government and the Ontario government, and this is the case across Canada, have poured billions of dollars into supporting communication expansion. It's all controlled by monopolies, whether it's Rogers or Bell or TELUS in these various areas. And we're stuck. We don't have anything to show for that. But if we had provincial telephone companies such as SaskTel across the country, they would have a mandate to provide service versus a mandate to provide profit.
I think this is also an issue that directly relates to the ongoing, never-ending battle about CBC as well. Because, everybody knows CBC's mandate originally was to provide first radio and then television to Canada, period. All of it. And that was their mandate. Not how much money they could generate, not how much margin they could squeeze out. Their mandate was to provide a service, not to be profitable. And I guess that just applies across the entire spectrum as far as governments, provincial and federal, getting out of financing infrastructure on their own. Like, what reason do you think it is that governments have caught on to this P3 thing? What is the short-term political benefit for them?
Governments caught on to the whole P3 thing, and it's all started after the 80s, after Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher, who led the way and introduced this whole idea of private corporations having the right to provide monopoly services to the community. And we get into the 80s, and in Britain, they start talking about private sector delivering government services, or what we thought were mandatory, important, vital services. If you look at what those mandatory vital services are, there are things like electricity, there are things like water, there are things like healthcare, there are things like telephone service, communications. And in Britain, in the 90s, they started to sell off huge tracts of government services. And then it carried over into the rest of the Western society, including the United States and Canada. In Canada, the big changes started in the 90s. And they started at the end of the Brian Mulroney era in government, when he brought in the free trade agreement, and the Liberal government of 1993, or when Jean Chretien was elected. And that's where governments, faced with deficits and the ongoing growing Canadian deficit, had made a decision to slash the deficit in a big way. Brian Mulroney, when he was Prime Minister, couldn't find it in himself at that point to slash the deficit in the way that Jean Chretien and Paul Martin did in 1995. When they started to slash the deficit, they made a decision. Healthcare, welfare, and post-secondary education, which were being largely in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% funded by the federal government across the country, was drastically reduced. When they reduced all of that, they saw that this was unpalatable to many people. So what they did was, money that they allocated for those 3 or 4 distinct ideas were put into an envelope, so a province could use that money in any way they wished to. They slashed healthcare, post-secondary education, welfare, and funding for people with disabilities. All of that was changed via an envelope, which now became 1 envelope instead of 4. And that envelope had about 40% less money. So the federal government was no longer funding healthcare at 40 or 45% across the country. The federal government was now funding healthcare in the neighborhood of $10 or $11 per hundreds that the provinces were spending.
No, that's true. And I mean, I'm just thinking about that. And it was when the feds started to make their drastic cuts. And of course, by then it had become popular throughout the Western world to say that deficits were our mortal enemy and we're going to eliminate them because we must. But, you know, I mean, I just want to drop this now. We'll get into it more as we go on, but we're seeing the results of that labor now. I mean, there are infrastructure, physical deficits in every core system of our society, from healthcare to education to roads and transportation to airports to ports to communications, you name it. We're paying the price now. So, I mean, that's why I asked the question, what exactly is the political bait for them to do it? And is that not it? It's that they can go to the people and say, look how we've cut spending. While we're here, while we're in office, everything's fine. When your kids have to buy cell phones and pay for utilities, well, that's another problem. Isn't that what we see? The results are starting to look like everywhere now?
The results are starting to show. And what we need is some dynamic leadership to happen to address some of these things. When I think back to 1972, when I was in British Columbia and in high school, just barely in high school, and the election of the Dave Barrett government, rest in peace, Mr. Barrett.
Yes.
But this government was there to fix things, because that was the beginning of the end, and they saw that. And when I became a member of the BC government in the 90s, in 1992, our government made substantial change, and it was the only government in Canada that did not cut health care despite the federal cuts to health care funding. We were ridiculed for those decisions. And it was a very hard time to govern in Canada. And so we have that continuing today, where government deficits are maligned, where government investments in infrastructure are maligned, because the private sector can do better. Here in Ontario, we have the example of the 407 highway, which is a public-private partnership, or in the terms of our current Prime Minister, asset recycling, where we sold that highway built by the province of Ontario to a private corporation. That idea is meaning that we're paying more and more individually for these services. For the life of me, I don't know how we're going to change things other than for some bold speakers, some bold people to come out and point out, without using messaging, which all of our politicians seem to use. We need people to come out and tell people how much these things are costing us. Because public-private partnerships are leading us into a world where we're going to be paying for the air we breathe in 50 years.
I find a very familiar pattern here. And, you know, it's interesting, Rick, that you bring up the first efforts of the Chretien majority with Paul Martin as the finance minister. And, of course, to this day, there's so much made about how the Chretien government got Canada back on the right track. But it came at a definite cost that we're paying today. We will continue to pay. Our children will pay. But it became a battle cry. I think that what Chretien did out of Ottawa allowed governments like the Campbell government in BC to start this path. It certainly motivated Ralph Klein in Alberta. It motivated Mike Harris in Ontario. To a certain degree, it motivated René Lévesque in Quebec. It was okay now to withdraw services because we have to slay the deficit dragon. Now, was this any sort of, do you think it was any sort of concerted effort, or is it just the way it worked out?
Well, I was listening to a video earlier today with Dave Barrett talking to Von Palmer, recorded back in 2006. And Dave Barrett was saying that you have to remember, he said, that governments for years have been tools for corporations. Those corporations were looking to take over and do things and make more money. And they will do anything to defeat governments who don't. And he talked about British Columbia, and he said, in 1975 when I lost, I knew I was going to lose because at that point, the liberals and the conservatives had come together because it was anything but the socialists. That is the case federally, and has been the case federally since this country has been founded. The idea is that we have to continue to prosper and support the private sector. The private sector has all the answers, and that's not the case. I mean, clearly we can point to that, and I can point to the 90s example in British Columbia, even though that was fraught with scandal and all kinds of things when the NDP government was in power there. What they had done was challenge the current situation in this country. And when you do that, you scare big business. Jean Chretien and Paul Martin both campaigned on the idea that we were going to have childcare, a national childcare program. In 1992, that was a champion idea by Paul Martin and Jean Chretien running for Prime Minister. That was in the Liberal platform in every election that Jean Chretien won. We still don't have a national child care program. That shows you they're talking about these things. They say the good things. I mean, it's like Justin Trudeau today talking about, or before the election, talking about getting protection for Canadian rivers and lakes, which the Conservative government of Stephen Harper had removed, and bellowing that this was an atrocity. Here we are, 2 years and a bit more into Trudeau's government, and nothing. No law has been changed to prevent what Harper had done. So we have all these things happening, and it's a bent toward corporations and to the expansion of the private sector and control of the private sector of our environment, and the less involvement of government, removing responsibility from politicians, putting on private corporations, and you and I, our ability to pay for those services.
Yeah, it does seem to be abandonment would be a word that a lot of people would use. I would probably play it a little safe and say it's merely a turnaround of the way government views their role in controlling the cost of living on essentials, because nobody in this modern day and age, well, very few that are far outside what we consider to be civilization, who must fend for themselves. But I mean, in this day and age, nobody can survive without electricity, likely natural gas, water. I mean, these are fundamentals of life in our day and age, and it would seem that government no longer feels it is their place to protect the consumer, which is the taxpayer, because they have more important sources to listen to. I agree with you that, there's no quick fix. This is endemic now. It's part of how things work. And I find it very interesting that you bring up the case of the NDP government in BC getting a lot of heat automatically because they wanted to buck the system. And I think when Chretien was doing his program, He stayed popular in Ottawa, and yet look at what happened to Ralph Klein in Alberta. Oh, he was through the roof because it was almost like, oh, Chretien, you're going to cut the budget? Hold my beer. Ralph Klein slashed everything, and he seemed to only get more popular. I mean, we're paying for that now. BC will pay. Ontario will pay too, with McGuinty and Wynne and what was left them from Harris. But I guess my question to you is, when will enough be enough? When does it become a threat to the politicians? I mean, they'll bend over backwards for corporations until the point comes where they may actually have to pay for doing so. Do you think that there's a way that this can become more of an issue than it is currently?
I think that time is coming, and it's certainly coming. It came in British Columbia after 16 years of fairly corrupt government in British Columbia. I mean, you have to look at this and say, Gordon Campbell was convicted of drinking and driving in Hawaii. Now, any cabinet minister in Gordon Campbell's government would have had to resign as a result of that. Probably would have resigned as an MLA as well.
Mm-hmm.
Gordon Campbell managed to stay on. When you look to what Ralph Klein did in Alberta, where he threw the 20s in a drunken rage at a homeless shelter onto the floor, you would have thought that would be the end of somebody so callous as a leader in this country. And you go to the divine government in Saskatchewan, which was probably one of the most corrupt governments in this country's history.
But yet...
So he was so bad, the people had to dissolve the Conservative Party in that province to become the Saskatchewan Party. So the same players got rid of the name, but they became the Saskatchewan Party. And the story goes right across the country. The fact that Paul Martin was Prime Minister, and as Prime Minister who owned a fleet of ships that traveled the world and delivered goods from here to there, was using foreign flags on his ships and not Canadian flags, at the same time as chastising folks for not investing in Canada. All of these things lead us to a perpetual effort by folks in the media and in government to look at the private sector, and the private sector can always do things better when we know they can't. The evidence is clearly laid out by many, many, many people. So we need to look at why are we privatizing so much government. We're doing it to avoid debt. We're doing it to avoid raising taxes. We're putting it all off to the future.
Yes. Well, I find that very interesting when you just said that, and I was thinking about it, because there has to be somebody who's going to get left holding the bag. And, I think what just happened in the last election in British Columbia, although it was extremely close and it's a coalition government, the corrupt Liberals are no longer government. And people were expecting some real change, considering some of the decisions of the Horgan-Weaver coalition. A lot of people are asking, quelle différence? There's, it's just everything's orange now instead of red. We're still getting screwed. So the day is coming. It did come in Alberta. BC thought they got theirs. Saskatchewan may get theirs in their next election. And I would venture that the Saskatchewan Party at the end of the day may carry on the legacy of the divine Conservatives as the GTH scandal gets more and more airtime. But Do you think that Kathleen Wynne is going to be the one to hold the bag, or not this time?
Kathleen Wynne is very likely to lose this election unless Doug Ford gets elected as leader of the Conservative Party here in Ontario. The Liberals in Ontario have been very, very successful in elections after elections here because of the faux pas created by their Conservative opponents in every election. They've never been able to amount, since Dalton McGuinty was elected in his first election, they've never been able to mount a successful campaign based on what they will do. Every single campaign has been around what the Conservatives might do if they're elected. And what's interesting is that in Ontario, we have Kathleen Wynne, who has managed to sell 60% of Ontario hydro to the private sector. The whole reason for the Liberals winning in 2003 was the fact that the Conservative government of the day and Premier Ernie Eves were going to sell, or had tried to sell, Ontario hydro. And with that kind of thing, the success of the Liberals is that they demonize the Conservatives, and when they get into power, the same people who pay the Conservatives to run pay the Liberals to run, and the Liberals manage to do what the Conservatives couldn't possibly do. So here in Ontario, we have a Liberal government that has privatized Ontario hydro. And I said they went even further with what I call secret privatization, where everybody says that hydro is sacrosanct. It is important to our community, and the public has to provide it. So what we have in Ontario for the last 10 years is we've been privatizing the production of energy that hydro provides to Ontario folks. That privatization of hydro has been done by stealth. So we get these different gas plants created and built, and we guarantee them 20 years, 30 years of profits, whether they produce power or don't. We buy every cent of power they produce or they don't produce. And that's to ensure that we have power when we need it. And that goes all back to the ice storm when we lost power in places, and it goes to the great big blackout that happened several years ago across the northern U.S. and Ontario. We privatized it. So now we're guaranteeing them, a private corporation, profits, and the same profit every year. Why couldn't we build those energy producing systems ourselves? And if we need to cut back, we can cut back. We don't have to pay somebody to do it. That's what's happened.
Indeed, that's definitely the story of BC Hydro that started with the run-of-river projects. I mean, I think most of my listeners are familiar with it, and we've alluded to it in our discussions as well, but there was a time when BC Hydro thought that they needed increased capacity, so instead of adding turbines to an existing dam that they owned and operated, they started run-of-river IPP, independent power producer contracts, instead of increasing their own capacity. And
that was all done as a result to privatize BC Hydro, because the BC Liberal government couldn't at that point go to the public and say, we want to privatize hydro's production of hydro. So what they do in stealth is create a program where they allow public-private partnerships, which is what this is.
Yes.
An individual to build a hydro project on this river And then hydro is told they cannot produce any more hydro themselves. They have to buy it from these private corporations that are building these little things all over the province. What it does is it moves the control of the Crown Corporation from looking at costs and keeping that and having to pay profit and having to pay private sector. So pretty soon you're going to find that you're producing more power, or you're providing more power from the private sector versus the public sector, and we're paying more for it. And particularly the public-private run-of-the-river systems, in British Columbia, where there's a premium set there that is extremely high.
Yeah, that is the thing that's definitely been proven with BC Hydro. Not only do they have too much money going out for power they're not getting, the rate that they are paying is exorbitant. Nobody else in the world would pay those rates except for what's left of Crown utilities. So, I mean, this is the big talk in BC is about BC Hydro is going to be forced into receivership, not because of their own mistakes, but because that the government of the day forced them to privatize their supply on fixed terms that are ironclad. So is that a problem going forward in Ontario? There's been a lot of noise about it, but is the Ontario infrastructure of electricity so leveraged out that what's left of Ontario Hydro may have serious problems?
We're facing a serious issue here where the Ontario government is now, Ontario Hydro, what's left of Ontario Hydro, is now paying New York State to take power on many occasions. So we've paid millions of dollars to other agencies to take the power that we have produced because we're forced to produce it due to these contracts. And if these were Crown-owned power-producing plants, we wouldn't have to do that.
And I will venture a guess and say that the resale to other markets is at a loss.
The resale that from Ontario Hydro to New York, of course, is not at a loss. The resale is at a loss, Ontario Hydro loses money. They're actually paying people to take our power. And then that company, New York State, or be it Massachusetts or some other place in the United States, which is connected on the grid, then sells that power, and they're making money because we've already paid them for it, and they can sell that power for cheaper. And that's the same thing that's happening in British Columbia to an extent. We're paying 10 and 12 and 15 times the cost of power to these run-of-the-river operations versus BC Hydro investing in another turbine in the Kootenays for one of their dams that they already own there, which would have made these run-of-the-river projects unneeded. They weren't needed. But BC Hydro was forbidden by the provincial government to produce any new power. They had to seek it from the private sector, and everything was put in place by the Liberal government to make it very profitable for the private corporations who did it.
Now, this is a pretty straightforward picture, in my opinion, of what the P3 model in hydroelectricity and utilities has brought us across most of the country. But that the P3 model has infected a lot more essential services, has it not? For one example, I know Alberta and Ontario are pretty much all on the same bandwagon with privatization of transport infrastructure, highways, maintenance, winter maintenance, that sort of thing. Is there anything that is not as bad as hydro? But it seems to be when we look at the P3 model with a decade or two experience, it's the same train wreck, isn't it?
It is the same train wreck, and in some cases it's worse. In British Columbia, in the late 80s, the at that time social credit government of the day had privatized highways maintenance. Then we have privatization a couple of years later in Alberta, and then it goes to Ontario where we privatized highways maintenance. All of that took government workers whose job was simply to make the roads safe to pass on, safe to drive on, and put in the private sector who would take over those operations. So there were, in British Columbia, about 45 different regions that were divided. In Alberta, there was 20 or so different areas divided. And in Ontario, the same thing, where you had one company providing service up to a certain boundary, and then another company would take over and do it from there to there. And so you had a hodgepodge of differences of services, differences of maintenance, differences of success in making the roads safe to travel. One of the most controversial items in all of this along the way has been how well these roads are maintained in the winter. And when you think about it, you can ask yourself, if I'm working for the provincial government in the Ministry of Highways or Transportation in my province, my job is to make this road safe to travel. So I'm going to plow that road when it's needed. When you're a private corporation, all of a sudden we have to set rules saying you have to plow the road when there's 1.5 inches of snow, or maybe it's like 4 centimeters of snow. You have to plow the road. You have to prepare the road with a certain solution that will melt the ice so that the road is safe to travel on. And then you have to monitor them to ensure that they're doing those things. That's been the biggest failure in road maintenance and winter travel in Canada in our history. We're not doing a very good job of it, and that's because we've privatized it. They have to make money for their investors, which means, do I go out and clear the snow from the road? Or do I wait another half hour or another hour? Because if I wait, I'm going to pay less for worker salaries while they do that, or less on services.
Yeah, it does seem to be a very big change in mission. There's no doubt about that. Talking about that, in Alberta, the highway from Edmonton to Fort McMurray, Highway 63, for a long time was known as the Highway of Death. And in the 90s, once highway maintenance was privatized, there was a big issue because there was a demonstrable difference in what contractor was looking after their part of the road. There were a lot more accidents, more fatalities on certain contractors' areas than others. And because it involved death, it actually got traction. And there were some changes made. And those contractors were forced to put up or they would be booted. So isn't that something else that seems to hold true for P3s across the spectrum? Everything is kind of let slide. Well, we'll just try. Yeah, that shouldn't have happened. We're really sorry about that. But just like we said before, the policies come in for all the cuts, the government changes, but the cuts don't. Isn't it the same for the P3s? They may get a slap on the wrist, they may get this, that, but nothing ever really changes once they're in, does it?
Well, there's a big difference in responsibility and in goals for a project. When it's the government's ultimate goal or our ultimate responsibility is looking after the public good. When you're a private corporation, your ultimate responsibility is looking after the good and the interests of your shareholders. That is the difference. Now, when your company is providing a public good, the big difference between government and private sector is that private sector works on a risk-based analysis. The public sector works on doing everything they can to protect against risk. So that the cost differential between public and private is found right there. It's the amount of risk and the amount of profit in the system. So when we have and this is just a simple example of that kind of thing. When you have a worker working for a private contractor clearing roads, chances are the worker is making less money than if they were a government employer. The next thing is that the worker is also not deployed as quickly as they would be in the public sector. And the reason for that is the private sector looks and says, if we don't clear the road right now, what is our risk? What is the ultimate risk? So they see that their risk is very low or lower. So they don't plow the road right then. And then an accident happens, something happens, and it's one accident or it's two accidents. But that's not measured when we talk about the government providing service versus the private sector. We never talk about that.
That's a very good point. We never really discuss the important outcomes. It's presented in the spectrum of cost. But that cost is just numbers on a piece of paper. It's not cost in lives, is it?
No, that's exactly it. And it runs the gamut in all kinds of public and private ventures that go together, whether it's in hospitals, whether it's in schools, or whether it's in highways maintenance, or whether it's in how government contracts these services out to the private sector. In Ontario, in British Columbia, certainly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where public-private partnerships have been built or put forward, which are providing hospitals, community centers, all of these things, where small towns of 15 or 20 or 30,000 people are building a new arena community center. The monies that were provided from federal and provincial governments to support those efforts had to come from public-private partnerships. And in these cases, they had to guarantee the amount of ice time in the arena that would be paid for by a variety of programs. Many municipalities are finding it very hard to keep up because they have to pay this private entrepreneur who built that arena and is guaranteed a certain return. So all of these things are costing us more money in the end. Because if we had built that arena ourselves in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan versus the private sector, our arena we would own, and if we operate it, we pay for the operating costs when we're operating it, and when it's vacant, we're not paying. Today, in circumstances like that, we are paying whether we use it or we don't. And when you add to this factor that municipal, provincial, and federal governments borrow money at a much cheaper rate than private sector, we're paying even more.
Absolutely. And, that goes all the way up the scale, too. It's not just Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. Edmonton has Rogers Place downtown, the new palace for a billionaire NHL owner. the city of Edmonton financed that $560 million to build that arena. And what you described about the usage still applies here. So, I mean, there's something, in my opinion, fundamentally wrong with this game. But I wanted to ask you again and bring it up. The 407. Now, I was in the GTA last fall, and that was my first exposure to it. And it's like, okay, so this is a toll highway that is very parallel to other roadways, but it's newer, it's in great shape, but you got to pay to drive on it, either through transponder or the hard way if you don't have one. I took the 407 once to somewhere and back, and what I noticed was there was absolutely no garbage anywhere. There was absolutely no OPP. I would say the speed limit on the 407, the part I was on, was maybe 130 or 140. And I just seemed to get the impression that, oh, okay, so this was built with tax dollars, but now if you pay to get on here, you can pretty much do whatever you want. Because I understand that the OPP is not going to set up speed traps on 407 when people pay to drive on it. Probably not a good public relations move. But is there a real effort to make projects like the 407 become appealing to the public to get around the big picture of how ridiculously wasteful what's happened to the 407 is?
Well, the 407 was started under the Bob Rae government, and the idea was that it would be a toll highway, but the province would continue to own it. And it was sold under the Mike Harris government to a Spanish corporation. It's now owned by some pension companies as well as the Spanish company. Mm-hmm. And I drove out of curiosity last year for the first time, the 407, and normally I would drive on the 401, but the traffic was heavy, and we thought, okay, well, we're thinking about trying this again, or trying this, and we did, and ended up with a $27 bill for driving about 100 kilometers. And it was like, how is that possible? I mean, we're paying a private corporation $27 for a highway that we mostly paid for.
Yeah, it did make a whole lot of sense to me. And I mean, I looked into it, and it's like, okay, a transponder is this much, and but you still have to pay an entry and an exit, even if you have a transponder. That was something that just, like, you guys know no limits. You will just, even though we paid for a license to drive on your precious road, so we still have to pay to get on every time. It just seemed like such a ridiculous racket. But I guess it depends on your lifestyle. I do know a couple people in Toronto that gladly pay the 407 to be able to go like a bat out of hell and not have to put up with the traffic. So that, again, it makes me ask, do P3s encourage the loss of universality even though the money comes from everybody?
P3s do encourage the loss of universality. And it doesn't matter where you are in the P3 system. P3s add an additional cost, whether that cost is paid by you as an individual or by a provincial crown corporation who has to pay the cost, or whether it's paid with your tax dollars. They are expensive. P3s are simply instead of us putting up the money to build a highway, a hospital, a school, maintain our highways, maintain our hospitals, it is a way for politicians today to make the amount of money that the public puts up front looks small. But every year that we are contracted with that private entity, we are paying a huge sum.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at a hospital where we're paying a private company to provide maintenance of the hospital, provide cleaning of the hospital, provide security for the hospital for 25 or 30 years, we're paying a huge surcharge. We're paying that surcharge to include an amount of profit for that private company.
Yeah.
Instead of us building it ourselves and maintaining it. And the other thing is that the person who's cleaning the hospital is being rushed in their job. So what I need is that one cleaner per floor or per unit in a hospital has 8 hours to get in there and clean that floor and make everything safe. Well, since we've started to privatize hospitals and cut back in funding and staffing in hospitals across the country, we've had far more cases of infections that people have contracted in hospitals. If you've been in a hospital in the last 10 or 15 years, you see it's a whole lot dirtier than it was 20 years ago. And that's because all of these things, it's like rush, rush, rush. And if you're an employee who's working for this company who's going to be paying you much less, it's no longer a career. This is a stopgap job. It's not a career to look after the floor in your hospital anymore. It's a stopgap job. So something better comes along, you're going to go for that. So you're making less money. You have to do twice the work that somebody there before who thoroughly did the work. It's not the workers' fault here. They have to run like heck. Whereas we all suffer because the job isn't done from a standard that says, whatever it costs, we're going to make our hospital safe.
Absolutely. Everybody loses except the contract holder. What a surprise. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is not only provincially or nationally, internationally now, we're seeing the same old players step into similar roles in different countries, on different continents. They seem to have found their niche in the supply chain for governments that are P3 friendly. It's quite obvious what the perils can be in that, but just earlier this year, a corporation called Chretien, which is out of the United Kingdom, it employed 43,000 people worldwide, and they have contracts in Canada. They have contracts in Ontario and Alberta specifically. I know they are involved with Ontario hospitals. Why is there no... I mean, the British government said that they knew Chretien were in trouble, but they continued to award new contracts to them with public money for services that there was a good chance they will never provide, not only tying up all that money, but where are the services? You know? So, I mean, I know there's been issues on Ontario currently about Chretien and the hospitals that they're contracted to. What's going on there?
Here's the huge thing with Chretien, and it's a perfect example of where things have gone wrong and why Ontario and Canada, which seems to be hell-bent on privatizing and doing more of these things. In Ontario, Chretien does road maintenance, they do road construction, they do hospitals, they're part of consortiums that build hospitals and maintain them for 20 or 30 years. And then when you get into the whole contracts and things like that, if you have to change the kind of lighting that's used in the hospital to make things better or to meet new standards, that's all an add to pay. When you want the hospital to do more cleaning, that's all add to pay.
Mm-hmm.
Case of Chretien, They bid on several highways areas contracts in Ontario where they really and severely underbid other contractors who had bid for those jobs to get those jobs. And the same thing they did in Britain. They kept underbidding everyone. And it was to add mass, add grandeur to this company so that it would be this snowball that could not be stopped. And that's what's happened. This snowball that can't be stopped now is a phony business experiment. It's nothing but a pyramid in some respects. They bid so low they can't afford to actually provide the services that are required. And in Ontario here, we're looking at cases where many hospitals, and I think we're up at 7 or 8 here, which are run by Chretien, are at some risk, and the provincial government is going to have to come to find other contractors to take over or to actually hire employees to run these hospitals, to keep them clean, keep the heat on, keep the water running, and make sure that people can get into those hospitals. That's the damage that's been done by Chretien. And Chretien is like the small player in Canada, a big player internationally. They cover 42,000 kilometers of highways maintenance in the country. In Ontario, they were fined almost $1 million for failure to meet their contract terms.
So again, when you discuss the risk management model, I guess they found it cheaper to just pay the fine when they got caught than to actually fulfill their contract.
That's exactly the case. I mean, I'd love to get into that whole thing. The whole business culture is based on risk, all of it. And that doesn't matter whether it's in pipelines or whether it's in airline industry or whether it's in road maintenance or operating public hospitals with private sector contracts. It's all based on risk. What's the risk over 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? It's not about how to prevent that from happening.
Well, it kind of sounds to me like Chretien probably looked at what happened in 2008 and said, you know what? If we just buy every contract we can find and embed ourselves in the core structures for delivering services, we will become too big to fail.
That's exactly what Chretien was doing. We'll be too big to fail, so we have to fill contracts with government money. We have to provide you with more money when you get into a circumstance that doesn't meet the needs of the community. And that's the case with almost every public sector contract when it starts to go downhill.
Wow. The problems with Chretien have been out there for quite some time for people to see. I mean, they ended up over 2.6 billion Canadian in debt. Their stock price has plunged 70% in the last, not that long, in the last 6 months. So the writing was on the wall, but yet, it's just, yeah, things are rough. Yeah, just keep sending us that check. We'll be here. We'll be here. These are standards that never would have been allowed with state-owned services. But now, because of where we are in the process, the public who pays for it at the end of the day just has to put up with this stuff?
Well, that's the message we're getting from the neoliberal it's a neoliberal response to how things need to operate. I mean, many years ago, or not many years ago, maybe it's like 6 years ago, I was in North Carolina for several months in the summer, and when I was there, the municipality of the region was short on water. So they thought, well, maybe they would tap into a private water source. Here's this guy who held the water rights for enough water more than enough water to serve the whole county. And he was demanding an exorbitant amount of money. Not surprising, because that's the way it goes. And the public were forced to cut back. The public couldn't, because they could not enter into an agreement with that individual to buy water. And that guy, even though they were facing a dire situation in central North Carolina, he would not make the water available except at a certain price, which was apparently too high for the government, municipal government, to pay. That's an astounding thing to think of, something like water that is available and at no cost to this other individual could not be used by the public.
That just sounds so antithetical to what government is supposed to be doing for people. It is a ridiculous problem. Now, one other thing related to healthcare, I wanted to mention BC and their what they call MSP, Medical Service Plan. And they've been privatizing out for a long time. The post-2001 wave of outsourcing with Maximus BC Health, over the last 10 years, that contract has grown by 50%. Yet P3s were always advertised as the economical way for efficiencies and delivery of services. So, I mean, in 2005, when Maximus signed, it was to have a fixed value of $324 million. But yet, they have been paid $489. Now, again, like you said, when these P3s are signed, at their inception, the conditions are laid out. So anything in addition is in addition of cost, over and above, correct?
Correct. That's what happens in these situations. I can give you a small example, and then I'll come back to what happened with MSP. But two towns in central British Columbia, Williams Lake and Quesnel, both of them were about the same size. And in the 80s, Williams Lake decided to contract out their garbage disposal business. And Quesnel decided to keep theirs in-house. 5 years into the contract with the private contractor in Williams Lake, they found themselves paying something like 15% more than the city of Quesnel, just 75 miles north of them. The city of Williams Lake had already sold all their equipment. They would have to go and buy garbage removal equipment in order to take back that contract from the private contractor. The city of Quesnel said, we might pay a tiny bit more, but we're more in control of what we're doing. To this day, the city of Quesnel is paying less for garbage removal, and the city of Quesnel is using public employees, versus Williams Lake, which is using a private contractor, and the city of Williams Lake is at the mercy of this private contractor every 5 years when they sign an agreement. And so you have these whole situations where government says it's going to cost $5 million to build a new arena. But if I put that on the tax bill right now, that's going to cost all of us $20 a month, or $20 a year in our taxes. But if I don't put that on our tax bill and I contract it out, that's going to put $30 on our monthly or yearly tax bill. It's going to cost us more.
It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me.
It never makes sense to privatize things like highways maintenance, which is important for people. Building our roads, why do we contract that out? building our infrastructure that is vital to community, like hydro, like our hospitals, like our schools. Nova Scotia just bought out 10 different private public partnerships over schools because of the cost.
Just as a side note, here in Alberta, they only managed one big round of P3 schools before it was stopped. In Edmonton, I was involved in building 9 of those schools, and I can, I'll go sit in a witness stand and say this. It was very obvious to me that things were done on the job sites that were done for the sole purpose of creating more revenue, making mistakes on purpose, doing things that were designed wrong, doing them wrong anyway, and then bringing it up. There's just such another level of being able to hide, and the acceptance that that's the way it is. There is just inherent fat and graft within the P3 system that with the private-public partnership, I'm sorry, that's private information. The people who are paying for this are not allowed to know those details about how we're getting ripped off. Isn't that one of the biggest problems?
That's one of the problems, and that's why people don't necessarily understand fully why public-private partnerships aren't necessarily good for taxpayers, because there's an industry-specific protection for these things. It's like when you're sending laundry from a hospital in Salmon Arm, British Columbia, to Alberta, to Calgary for cleaning. And then you discover that the laundry that's sent to the Calgary for cleaning is not cleaned in the way that's required. It's cleaned in regular washing machines instead of these highly sterilized machines, which are supposed to ensure that the materials going back to the Salmon Arm Hospital are clean. That's been discovered in the last couple of years. And how is it possible? It's good for the BC economy to send laundry from Salmon Arm in the interior of British Columbia to Calgary, some 700 or 800 miles away, to do the laundry. How is that okay that we're in this situation where we're privatizing something in order to remove direct operating costs from a budget today, and we have to pay tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's a real good overall statement. The difference, both sides have a risk to assess, the private side and the public side, but the risks that they find paramount differ quite a bit, obviously.
When you look at Ontario's Auditor General recently came out with a report which looked at public-private partnerships that were going on here. And one of the things that she discovered was that in Ontario, the risk assessment that was being used to decide whether something should be private or the public put far more risk on public responsibility versus private responsibility, meaning that it made more sense under that formula for the government to seek a public-private partnership to build a road, build a hospital, build a school, build a government, build the office, build a government service. And so what we found in the end is that Ontario had spent $8 billion more over the course of about 7 years on public projects were done by P3s than we needed to, because we provided an advantage in our formula for calculating how this is all done to the private sector.
Well, that definitely brings us right into the Ontario Auditor General Bonnie Lysyk report of 2014, which at the time they said it put a microscope on the Wynne government. But really it was more of just a look at what's been going on for the last 20 years in Ontario. But what the Auditor General found was 74 infrastructure projects through private-public partnerships have cost taxpayers at least $8 billion more in borrowing and other expenses than if they had been publicly funded. Infrastructure Ontario, the government's P3 agency, made a risky $224 million loan to the Mars Discovery District to bail out the Phase 2 tower. Ontario's ballooning debt, now these are 2014 numbers, $267 billion, March 31st, 2014, and was predicted to be close to $325 billion for fiscal year 2017-18, which is where we are right now. There was inadequate oversight of licensed daycare, with only 50% of operators having a criminal background check for staff on file. The annual immunization program had 21,000 instances where a physician or pharmacist was paid to give a second flu shot to a person. There's obvious gaps, not only in the way money's being spent, but in the results that can affect people's well-being. So, I mean, the Auditor General laid it out there, and that was 3 years ago now. Has anything changed?
No, nothing has changed. Ontario continues on the P3 model. Ontario just built a highway, was building this superhighway between Windsor and the rest of Ontario, where there's a huge interchange built there, where huge mistakes were made by the private contractor, the public-private partnership that was in place. They were costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and huge costs involved in repairing that. To this day, most Ontarians don't know how much that cost us or the private contractor to fix that mistake. We look at, as you mentioned, things like the cost of doctors and pharmacies providing flu shots to people multiple times, which was a huge cost. We look at the whole privatization of government infrastructure here. That has been the goal of the government, is to take that stuff off the government books. So you could have something simple. You have to build a school, as in the case of in West Kelowna right now. They're building a school. It's going to cost $35 million. That's on the government books in British Columbia right now. When you build a school in Ontario, there's a good chance that the $35 million debt for building that school is not on the government books. But what is on the government books is the $1 million a year payment to the private company that built the school. So over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to pay this private company $1 million to build that school, and that's going to cost us a ton of money, more than if we had done it ourselves. It goes with healthcare, it goes with education, it goes with hydro, it goes with telephone services. We have simply sold our ability to develop our communities and support our communities to the private sector versus the public sector doing things for the public good, whether that's electricity, telephone, hospital, education. We are giving that all away. We have to stop that and come back and say, what is this costing us? But nobody's really asking those questions.
Well, what about the conflicting story? Because, of course, every one of the big players that ends up in all these P3 deals, of course, they have their own lobbying organization to tell everybody what a great service they're doing for everyone. Now, when Auditor General Lisic's report came out and that $8 billion number hit the airwaves, immediately people from, quasi-infrastructure Ontario to the huge contractors said that that was just a complete misrepresentation because, in their words, big projects have big risks. And according to them, Ontario saved $14 billion over the past 9 years by putting the onus on private contractors to deliver on time and on budget or not get paid. Well, isn't that just bullshit, flat out? Because as my experience knows, and as yours knows, and as we've stated, these contracts have never-ending loopholes to increase the money. So isn't that just a false statement from the people who are fleecing us?
It totally is a false statement, and the Auditor General's report actually addressed that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's why they come through with these things, well, we save money by doing this and this and this. And that's because the province of Ontario, and this is the case with every other province and every federal government that is moving on public-private partnerships, is that they've exaggerated the risk of an activity. They're saying the risk to the province for building a hospital is so much. The risk to the province to building a highway or building a school or building sidewalks or building anything is high, and that the private sector is taking on that risks. Those risks, that's not true. The private sector is not taking on those risks. You and I are taking on those risks first by providing the private sector, as the Auditor General in Ontario pointed out, at a huge, unrealistic risk assessment, and then we're paying them more money to do something we could do for less, and turning over what we own to somebody else versus providing it ourselves. And that's the big difference. That's the message that people need to understand, is that we do not necessarily control the finances in this country. It's all being held and from the support of public-private partnerships.
Yeah, it does seem to me that the way it's presented, the risk to the public is vastly overstated, yet the risk to the public via the private contract is never mentioned.
All you need to do is look at some of the most blatant examples of the risk to the public. And the fact that even Canadian pension plans are involved in this. Look to the Thames River system in England, where Chretien and others own the contract to provide water and sewage services in Greater London. They have a monopoly there. They provide the services. They have failed to provide the services at an adequate level. Yet things like the Canadian pension plan are taking advantage of that because they're reaping huge profits by investing in the Thames Water Project. We're doing these things internationally with supposedly good instruments such as our pension plans. And in the end, what we're seeing is all of it is being done to make a profit versus providing a public good. None of it is being done for you or I. It's done for people who are investors.
seems antithetical. And I mean, the point was made when the report we're talking about, Auditor General Lissick in 2014, even at that point in time, there had already been provincial audits that had serious questions about public-private partnerships in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, British Columbia, and a previous one in Ontario to this one that all said the same thing. We are paying more for less. And yet it goes on. We see, I mean, the Harper government did say that there would be no federal infrastructure money available unless it was a P3 project. There was a lot of backlash to that. The Liberals have taken it back, but instead they've set up the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. So it's same shit, different pile.
That totally is the case. And here's the biggest problem with it. The fundamental problem with P3s in Canada is that there's no transparency in the details of the real costs of the project, very little accountability. The business cases, value for money assessments, and the assumptions on risk, the transfers are all kept secret. Along with our costs, our politicians commit us to paying these private P3 operators for decades. We're like, when business cases are released, they're very summary and heavily censored. We never get the full information, and it takes an extreme amount of dedication and effort to discover exactly what these things are costing us. And Justin Trudeau is looking at the Canada Infrastructure Bank with some investors from all over the world. And the idea is some federal seed money, which amounts to a couple of $1 billion. And then there's all this private sector that's supposed to come in. It's called, and Justin is talking about asset recycling. Let's sell Pearson International Airport to a private corporation. Pearson Airport is one of the most profitable airports around the world. It is a non-profit operation, which means its idea is to collect what it costs to operate it and to expand it to meet the needs. And it's done a fabulous job. It's the same with the Vancouver airport. It's the same with the Calgary and Edmonton airport. All of these airports are operated by non-profit organizations. If we turn that over, we sell those things to private corporations, we're selling even more of Canada's infrastructure to the private sector. Justin Trudeau is calling it asset recycling. What it is a garage sale, because you can make a ton of money in an airport.
Oh, indeed, you can. Having been in and out of Pearson 4 times in 2017, yeah, I'll say, oh yes, you can make a lot of money at an airport.
So there's a lot of change that we need to look at much of this. And the idea is it's government's unwillingness to take on debt, which many of us, we buy a home, we take on debt, and we pay for it 20, 30 years it takes to do that. The federal and provincial governments in this country aren't accepting that that's a possibility. That's how we can operate. They think we should operate like a business. Well, they need to understand that operating like a business means that you're operating on a risk-based analysis. And a risk-based analysis says the likelihood of some major catastrophe happening is low or it's a medium, and am I willing to accept that risk? If I'm willing to accept that risk, I do it. If I'm not, I don't. So that's the business model. The business model is not about providing the service. It's about making money from providing the service. The rest of us have to pay for the service.
That is another factor, too, because, I mean, the BC Auditor General went through that in 2015, 2014, and drew attention to that. The risk models that are accepted by government in determining what P3s go forward are simply nonsensical. And that Auditor General specifically said, how is there any revenue risk in a hospital? That's a ridiculous concept to even consider. And the counterparty risk is the province, always. That's the buck will stop with the province, which means the buck will stop with the taxpayer. And, you know, it just drives me nuts that for short-term political gain, governments are willing to force parts of the public system to go along with selling themselves off, just for short-term political gain, with absolutely no transparency on the long-term costs. And every once in a while, a project does come up that puts it on display for everybody to see. And I'm thinking about the corner in Toronto of College and University Avenue, the Mars Tower. Now, wasn't, you know, I mean, of course it was the Wynne government that had to deal with it, but can't a situation like this happen to any government? It's just a matter of time that they look this bad.
That's an example of privatization gone bad.
Indeed.
And it's a very public event. And the provincial government is now being forced to actually move government employees into those buildings in order to help reduce some of the costs. Although we're probably paying rent in other locations for years to come as a result of this. The provincial government, this is guilty across the country in many extents, is to try to move visible expenses off our government. The whole idea of Ronald Reagan was to remove as much of government as he could over the control in society. And Ronald Reagan succeeded in doing that in Canada, in the United States, and in Australia and in Britain in a big way, because we privatized so much. We turned so much of it over to the private sector. Today, we're faced with the costs of doing that. In the United Kingdom, with Chretien collapse, they're actually going to end up having to pay more to have other private companies take over the responsibilities that Chretien had taken and the contracts that they had signed. They're actually going to have to pay people more money to do the job that Chretien said they would do. It's going to cost a huge amount of money. The taxpayers are going to pay that, and we'll still have a very public-private entrepreneurial world in Britain. But failure to do that means no services for people who are disabled, means no train service, means no water treatment, means no sewage treatment, means quite a bit, means no hydro. We're at a loss unless we all want to get together and say, you know what, some of this public-private partnership doesn't look so good.
Well, I mean, that's exactly it, too. I mean, if you want to go to the main issue that's supposed to be at the core, look at the United States government. How many trillions of dollars are they in debt? They play their games and shut down for a week or so, but nobody's going to be declaring the United States government bankrupt. No government has ever, well, I shouldn't say that. Greece was forced to go bankrupt, but that's a different story. But in the Western world, no government in Canada is anywhere near that line where they will be foreclosed. So to make this game that we're saving money, but yet as the Carillion experience will show, and even as the hydro rates in Ontario come home to roost, and the Wynne government has moved and said, well, we have the fair hydro plan. We're going to lower people's rates because we understand that things are so screwed up. It's unfair for us to ask you to pay this much for something that isn't worth it. But now, again, Auditor General Lissick has looked at the Fair Hydro Plan and said that, well, yeah, it'll bring some relief right now, but the relief from that debt that the Fair Hydro Plan is supplying, well, when all is said is done, the Fair Hydro Plan will add an extra $4 billion to the cost. So how do you even get out of this stuff now?
That's an amazing, unbelievable situation that Ontario has found itself in that the government has privatized so much Ontario Hydro, and now we've had costs going through the roof here in Ontario. I mean, we used to be fairly reasonable hydro prices here. I have a kind of remote, off-the-grid property here in Ontario, and we actually made the calculations recently. It would cost us around $37,000 over the next 10 years to go with Ontario Hydro. But if we invested $34,000 in solar on our property, we would save money over the next 25 years. What's absolutely amazing is that in Ontario, you can pay $50 or $60 a month for not using one iota of power, 1 unit of electricity. So we're in a situation in this province where the province has paid wrongly huge sums to companies like Samsung to develop solar energy and provide power, and to people who for 2 years were able to get in on building solar and wind generation of electricity. We're now set to be paying exorbitant prices for our hydro. And none of that was necessary. None of that was necessary. It sure encouraged the growth of solar, encouraged the growth of wind generation. But we didn't need to encourage the growth of corporate profits at the disadvantage of the public. And then when we have the gas plant fiasco, I mean, we have like 10 or 11 gas plants that have been built under the Ontario Liberals in the last 15 years, which are guaranteed profits, whether we use electricity or not. Every single one of those plants could have been built by the public sector, by Ontario Hydro, to provide the power. And we wouldn't be paying those plants to sit idle or paying them a premium to get them to pump up electricity availability at certain points. We wouldn't be doing that.
It's a spiral. The last thing I want to bring up, Rick, is the election is coming. Is there anyone who's on the ballot who's going to do anything to change this course in Ontario?
The Ontario election is going to be significant, and part of that's going to depend on who the Conservatives pick as leader. But Kathleen Wynne has shown, Kathleen Wynne, there's nobody in Ontario who really despises her, but they really despise her government. And when you think of Kathleen Wynne, you can think of Mike Harris in the same kind of context. Mike Harris is despised because of all kinds of things that came out after his government was defeated. And so that the hope is that Andrea Horwath is going to come forward with a bold and progressive platform, which we haven't heard a great deal about to this day. The Conservatives in Ontario could have Caroline Mulroney, aka Justin Trudeau, and his father. Now we have Brian Mulroney and Caroline Mulroney. And the Liberals are running with Kathleen Wynne, who has failed to inspire people in Ontario. Has actually showed us that this isn't working. So it's up to Andrea Horwath to actually be bold, who's often seen by the general public in Ontario as the best leader of the three main parties in this province. She polls first every time. Come election time has always failed. This is her third time, or third kick at the can. This is it for Andrea. She doesn't do it. And what's needed here is for some very, very direct and communication to the people of Ontario, saying this is what we have to do and this is how we're going to do it. We'll see what the Ontario Conservatives do. Kathleen Wynne, of course, is hoping that Doug Ford gets the leadership of the Conservative Party, because that's, the Ontario Liberal Party, other than their first election in 2003, where everybody was mad at the Conservatives, they've not won a single election based on what they might do if they were government. The next election will be the same thing. Who can deliver stability? Who can right the ship? And so the Conservatives and NDP and Liberals will be battling it out. The Liberals are hoping like heck that it's Doug Ford, because they can contrast Kathleen Wynne and Doug Ford. Andrea Horwath is looking for some bold policy to present to people so that people look beyond Liberal or Conservative.
Well, it's going to be very interesting what happens as we head towards the Ontario election. Of course, we have the throne speech, I believe, on February 20th. Then we're going to have the Progressive Conservatives with the leadership convention, and we got a budget thrown in there. And then the Ontario Queen's Park's going to have to rise probably by sometime early March, latest, for the campaign to start. It's going to be interesting. Rick Barnes, I thank you for guesting on The View Up Here.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about all of these issues. And Ontario is certainly going to be interesting, and federal politics will also be fairly interesting with respect to how the infrastructure bank that federal government is moving forward on. We have lots of stuff ahead. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you, Rick Barnes. Okay, do I sound better now that I'm live again? Come on, respond, please. Does it sound better? Oh, nobody wants to talk to me now. Okay, well, quiet, really. Okay. How about that? Is that better? Oh, okay. Now I'm getting conflicting reports, both within Canada, so I can't say, well, no, I don't know that. Forget it. It's not important. Anyway, thank you to Rick Barnes. That P3 issue, it's across the country. It's across the Western world. And it's in Africa, too. and Russia and the Middle East and wherever McDonald's can be found. That's background for Ontario because it's an issue there. There will be more Ontario. You know that. I know that. We know that. Next Wednesday is February 14th. That's a big day to a lot of people. Therefore, there will be no The View Up Here next week. I will return in The View Up Here on February 21st. Who's going to be on? That's a good question. I'll let you know when I know. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here. Good night.